that the issue that we are facing here is simply not just about the 30-meter telescope and the desecration of Mauna Kea. That is at the forefront of the issue, but deep within this issue is the historical marginalization and disenfranchisement of Hawaiians and our culture and our rights as a people. And he has stated in that statement that he is hopeful that we can work together to find a peaceful resolution.
Hi, this is Ryan from Disruptarian Radio. We are now on day 9 of the Mauna Kea protest. It is July 23rd, 2019, and a few developments have taken place. Today, the Gemini Observatory had maintenance technicians go up to maintenance their telescope. There was 2 delicate instruments which help cool the telescope instruments that need daily maintenance and haven't had it for over a week after the observatory personnel all decided to leave the Mauna. So after they left the Mauna, I think on the second day of the protest, they did as much as they could to, shut down their operation, but still the delicate equipment up there needs daily maintenance, and they weren't able to get up there today. They were denied by the protesters access to the Summit Road.
Was there an attempt by somebody connected to the observatories to go up today?
Gemini arrived. We expressed to them the situation, and we told them that we want to work together and ensure that they can make it up the mountain today as quickly as possible. They pulled to the side. They sat there for about 15 minutes, and without any communication to us, they turned around and drove away. When I saw that, I ran to them. And I was huffing and puffing when I got there. And I expressed to them that we want to work together. We want to find a solution to this. And all we're asking is that you guys work with us as well, right? Express the fact that you feel that we should have access to the Mauna, that you do not support Kanaka being locked out from our sacred places. It's a simple request, right? And we asked them, to also express that they wouldn't support the use of excessive force and the National Guard on peaceful protectors again, not protesters, but protectors.
Press release from Mauna Kea Observatory's observatory technician car denied access to telescopes for critical maintenance. Hilo, Hawaii. At approximately 7:45 a.m. on Tuesday, July 23rd, a car containing technicians from Gemini Observatory was stopped by activists from entering the Mauna Kea access road. The observatory had been assured access the previous day in conversation with law enforcement and the Office of Mauna Kea Management. Despite prior public statements indicating observatory technicians would not be denied access to the telescopes, activists today contradicted their earlier position. Activists told observatory personnel that without a formal, public letter from the observatories supporting activists' demands of the state, access for critical technical maintenance is no longer supported. Upon initial approach, the car of technicians was initially waved through the bamboo gate. The driver stopped to speak with an official from the Office of Mauna Kea Management, at which point a kapuna approached the car, stating that access was not to be allowed. 5 additional activists then moved to stand in front of the car. This denial of access was contrary to the understanding of access approval by the Gemini crew members and the individual who had initially opened the gate. The car of technicians respectfully pulled to the side of the road at the request of the activists and waited for approximately 45 minutes. During that time, activist leaders indicated that they were working to determine whether the technicians should be allowed access. Eventually, the Gemini crew members elected to turn back, given the uncertainty of eventual access. The crew was flagged down on their way away from the access point with an appeal from activists to continue to wait. The crew stopped to speak with the activists briefly before continuing to the Gemini base facility in Hilo. The Mauna Kea observatories continue to support the efforts of state and county law enforcement to restore safe and reliable access to the access road. About the planned technical work at Gemini Observatory today, Gemini Observatory uses gaseous helium in a cooling circuit to maintain stable low temperatures for 2 highly delicate instruments used in astronomical observations. The cooling system has become unstable, which requires specialized technicians to shut down in order to prevent damage to the instruments and the cooling circuit itself. The observatory personnel plan to shut off the compressors, move one instrument at risk to a separate cooling circuit, shut down the second, disconnect specific joints in the cooling system, and perform a standard facility inspection that is usually conducted on a daily basis during normal operations. The planned technical work would have taken approximately 3 hours. The crew would have then come directly back to their Hilo base facility.
So tour bus companies cannot go up to the Mauna that regularly do. That's their, bread and butter of life. That's how they make their money and feed their family. The observatory personnel can't go up there. There's 11 observatories. I think there's around 100 staff. They can't go up there. And then the developers and the workers for these developers of the project itself, all of these union people and skilled laborers, craftsmen, they're not allowed up there. So thousands of people are without work that they had expected to have and that they were counting on to feed their family. And it's all because these protesters are claiming that this Mauna, this mountain, is theirs, genetically theirs, by some sort of genetic inheritance, that they own it, that nobody else should be able to decide what goes on up there. And I'll describe exactly what it's about. But what I wanted to do was go through the overthrow of Hawaii, because they call it an illegal occupation, that it happened without their consent, and that they want their nation back, their kingdom back. So if it's true, then we're going to have to get to the bottom of it. If it's not, then we also are going to have to get to the bottom of it. It's costing a lot of people their livelihood. People are going to be either getting on welfare, getting assistance, or starving. And so we need to figure this out. I've been talking to the Kingdom of Hawaii people since Jennifer Ruggles stepped down as county council member here in Puna. I went to 2 of her town hall meetings. I spoke at both of them, and I passed out some flyers to show my contest to their claims. And I'm going to let Ken Conklin, PhD of Hawaiian Studies from Hawaii here, describe the legality and the process of the overthrow. And did the United States do it, or was it Kanaka Maui, or was it foreigners who were born in Hawaii, basically native Hawaiians? I mean, native means a place where you were born. So native Hawaiians, Kanaka Maui, or the United States. And Ken Conklin, you can go to kenconklin.org, and he has more on Hawaii specifically at historymystery.kenconklin.org. So another thing I wanted to do was show this migration of Tahitians to Hawaii. DNA as well as language show that there was a Southeast Asian origin for the original inhabitants of Hawaii. And there's multiple, scientific studies, DNA studies, linguistic studies, as well as oral history saying that there was a group of people already established in Hawaii when the Tahitians came. They were smaller in stature, and they were easily overcome by the Tahitians. This was only roughly 1,000 years ago. And linguistics say that they come from Taiwan. There's multiple studies on this. This is from hawaii.edu, the one that I'm showing you right here, showing the similarities in the language between Fiji, Maori, Tahitian, and Hawaiian. And so these Polynesian languages are also very similar. Many of the words are almost identical. And it all has a 1,000-plus-year-old origin in this area in Polynesia. And so, oral traditions, show this migration happened, and that there was a people of smaller stature here. The DNA studies, they studied 1,000 Polynesians in different islands, and they all show this Southeast Asian origin. Both Fiji and Taiwan. Mostly they're saying it started in Taiwan, going to Fiji, and then it bypassed some of these other places and then eventually ended up here in Hawaii. And then there was Malaysian Papuans that ended up with migration later on. But the consensus is between all of these scientific disciplines, anthropology through oral history, and actually archaeology too, linguistics, and DNA all confirm this ancient origin from Southeast Asian of Hawaiians, and that Hawaiians, according to oral tradition, defeated and conquered this group of smaller statured people that has now been identified as people from Southeast Asia. So this doesn't, they're not homogenous to Hawaii. They don't belong here. They came from somewhere else. And then as we go through history, we see, King Kamehameha traded weapons for titles, and there was people like, I'm going to have to pause it for just a minute. There was several people that were made chiefs in Hawaii. Okay, yeah, so John Young, he was an advisor to King Kamehameha. He was given a title as chief, and he was the governor, basically, of Oahu. While King Kamehameha was gone sometimes, he also was a direct advisor to King Kamehameha.
The king was not opposed to foreign visitors. In fact, he welcomed them, but he also knew that they brought danger. To resist them, the islands must be united. Years passed as Kamehameha tried to find a breakthrough in the conflict, drilling again and again and again. 8 years later, the American trading ship Eleanora anchored at the village of Olowalu and rang its bell for trade. It was a relief. Days before, men from Olowalu had killed one of the Eleanora's night watchmen and stolen a boat. The villagers expected retribution, but instead they got this friendly gesture. Hundreds of them piled into canoes and headed out to trade. When they drew close, the captain opened fire with a double broadside of ball and nails. Over 100 unarmed men, women, and children were torn to pieces. Then the Eleanora weighed anchor and sailed away. So it seemed fate played a hand when, weeks later, a party of local warriors found the Eleanora's sister ship, Fair American, becalmed just offshore. They vowed revenge for the Eleanora's actions, boarded the vessel and killed 4 of the crewmen, sparing only a man named Isaac Davis because he had fought bravely. Kamehameha was furious about the incident. He liked to keep good relations with visiting ships and didn't want violent reprisals. He put Davis under royal protection and demanded he come to court. But when Davis arrived, he saw a familiar face. John Young, the boatswain of the Eleanora, who had been captured after the Olowalu massacre. The 2 men had only a moment to catch up before Kamehameha summoned them to an audience. The sailors were more than a little frightened as they approached the huge man. Still vital and powerful in his middle age, 8 years of conflict had in no way diminished this king. He gave the men a choice. Either they could die, or they could serve as members of his court. He would give them wives, land, and riches. He would raise them to Ail'i status and adopt them as his own family members. In return, they would give him what he needed most, guns and ships. Kamehameha had been long fascinated by the power of gunpowder. During Captain Cook's visit a decade before, he had toured the ships specifically so he could pump Cook for information on the Western way of war. This, he concluded, was the necessary tool to conquer the island.
King Kamehameha, not only traded land and titles for weapons such as the American, what was that ship that he traded for? But he also invited many haoles in, foreigners that is, such as the missionaries. Yeah, right here, I'm sorry, the Fair American. So, when King Kamehameha traded this land and titles and wives to these British subjects, he used that to go and conquer his enemies in neighboring islands. This was a tradition in Hawaiian history for about 700 years. Oahu would fight Hawaii. Hawaii would go and conquer Oahu. Maui back and forth with Hawaii and Oahu, and all these other wars. I mean, there's dozens of them. Massive wars where tens of thousands of Hawaiians died. And at the last one with King Kamehameha, after he came back from conquering Maui, his cousin rose up against him, and as his cousin was defeated, they had surrendered, and King Kamehameha's men pushed like 10,000 men off a cliff after they had surrendered, is the story. It's one of the stories anyway, but so yeah, this isn't new. Like, conquering an island is one thing. An overthrow of the government is another. The United States was formed by an overthrow, by a revolution, by a violent revolution. And was it legal? No, it was not illegal. It wasn't legal to commit treason against England to overthrow them in that colony. But they did, and that was just a few years before what happened to Hawaii. So we have to take this in perspective, and I'm going to go ahead and play some of the clips I've got here and give you some references, and everything else will be in the description. So if you need references to anything, check the description, such as the Morgan Report. You can go to morganreport.org, and there's actually an annexation document. So Hawaii was actually legally annexed, and I've got that document at disruptarian.com /knowledge-base/category/treaties. Anyway, that's in the description as well. And here is the Treaty of Annexation of 1898. So where they say there's no treaty, show me the treaty, there is actually a treaty. And as we keep going through these archives, like the Hawaii State Archive has 20 letters of recognition from countries all over the world, including countries like Dr. Tsai often references, like the Netherlands and Switzerland, the Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention. Well, by 1895, both of them had sent letters of recognition that the Republic of Hawaii was the legitimate government of Hawaii. That's in the Hawaii State Archives. It's also on my website. I've got it here in this knowledge base that I created. If you just go to that treaties link, I've got a whole bunch of documents, all of the documents of the letters of recognition that are in the Hawaii State Archives. And I've got the Morgan Report. I've got the anti-annexation petitions. A lot of people talk about that. Got collection of videos by Kenneth Conklin, Dr. Kenneth Conklin. Larson versus the Hawaii Kingdom. Dr. Tsai often references this, says that the case is still pending. It is not. It has been dismissed. There is nothing pending. He says it's pending fact-finding. So it hasn't been dismissed, but it's pending awaiting fact-finding. That is not true. If you read the actual case itself, it says that it's been dismissed. There is nothing left to litigate. And that's exactly what it says verbatim. Here's the Constitution of the Republic of Hawaii. Somebody asked me about this, and I gave them links on my last video. They were saying, well, was there any Kanaka Maui, was there any indigenous Hawaiians on the Republic of Hawaii's Constitution signing, or anybody that participated in the overthrow that were indigenous Hawaiians? And yes, there was. There's 5 of them on this Constitution of the Republic of Hawaii. The abdication document, the swearing of an allegiance by Queen Liliuokalani. So she not only abdicated, but then she swore an allegiance to the Republic. So anyway, I've got all that here on my website. I just wanted to put this all to rest if we can, because there's so much, crazy conspiracies about history. A lot of it's being propagated by this guy, who I think is a snake oil salesman, Dr. David Tsai. I have no idea how the guy got his PhD, because he leaves out so much. Like, he's really heavy on the pro stuff for this, sovereignty movement, but really light on the anti stuff, that supports the opposite theory. And such, cherry picking and selective work, such selective collection of sources, I think, in any legitimate PhD would be easily dismissed. Like I really think he should have his PhD removed from him, in my opinion, unless he was able to, show why he could dismiss things like the Morgan Report and things like the Bayonet Constitution, where at the time, and I'm going to let the sources from Dr. Conklin play after this, but the Bayonet Constitution was because the monarchy kept changing the Constitution and kept changing the government and kept changing the legislature, and kept dismissing their advisors and dismissing the legislature and dismissing voters that could help guide the country. So when they didn't get what they wanted, they would immediately dismiss everybody that would vote on it, and then they would get in new constituents and try to eliminate certain voters from voting, so that they didn't have a change in policy, or they didn't have things go something like it wasn't their way. I mean, this is easy to trace, and I'm going to play it for you. But the references are here at Disruptarian Radio, disruptarian.com, and at kenconklin.org. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully we can get through this mess.
Aloha, this is Leon Siu for Christian Heritage Week. A popular misconception is that the American missionaries overthrew the Hawaiian religious system. In fact, the kapu system was overthrown 6 months before the missionaries arrived. On October 3, 1819, Kamehameha II and the wives of Kamehameha the Great sat and ate together at a royal banquet. By doing so, they deliberately broke one of the paramount rules of the kapu system. This meant that the king no longer regarded the old religious system as valid. Furthermore, in support of the king's action, Hewa, the high priest, immediately burned the nearby temple, or heiau. The king and the kahuna then ordered all the temples in Hawaii be desecrated and the images of the gods burned. Through a supernatural act of God, in one fell swoop, the religious political system was cast down by those rulers who benefited the most from that system.
Regarding the legality and the morality of the annexation of Hawaii by the USA. Credit to Dr. Ken Conklin, Ph.D., reference to his website at www.kenconklin.org. The transition of Hawaii from a monarchy to a republic to then being annexed by the USA is a complicated history that spans over 100 years, starting with Captain James Cook in 1778. Shortly after Hawaii having contact with European explorers, bonds were made between the two nations, and many Europeans were adopted into the Hawaii Kingdom as advisors and chiefs. Fast forward 100 years and many of the descendants of these European-born Hawaiian subjects were running productive businesses in sugarcane and other goods like pineapples. Many genetic Hawaiians and native-born Hawaiian subjects of both American and European ancestry became worried about their investments in Hawaii with an ever-changing form of government and a power struggle in the monarchy. This is that story according to Hawaiian Studies Ph.D. Dr. Ken Conklin. 2 questions to answer. Was the 1893 overthrow of the monarchy illegal? Obviously, all revolutions are illegal. The American Revolution of 1776 was also illegal. Were most of the people living in Hawaii at the time of the overthrow opposed to it, in favor of it, or apathetic? We do not know, just as we do not know similar information about the American Revolution. There was no Gallup polls or B poll back then. Population statistics in 1890, ethnic Hawaiians were already a minority in the kingdom. Between 1890 and 1900 there was rapid immigration, primarily from Asia, further reducing the ethnic Hawaiian percentage of the population. The explosion of Asian population in Hawaii was partly due to King Kalakaua's trip to Japan in 1881 and his invitation for Japanese laborers for the Hawaii sugar plantations. The following figures are taken from the Native Hawaiian Databook, once available on the OHA website at www.oha.org. Hawaii Census of 1890, Kingdom, total population 89,990, Hawaiian 34,436, part Hawaiian 6,186. Therefore ethnic Hawaiians full or part, total 40,622 out of 89,990, which is 45%. Hawaii Census of 1896, Republic, total population 109,020, Hawaiian 31,019, part Hawaiian 8,485. Therefore ethnic Hawaiians full or part, total 39,504 out of 109,020, which is 36%. U.S. Census of 1900, Territory, total population 154,001, Hawaiian 29,799, part Hawaiian 9,857. Therefore ethnic Hawaiians full or part, total 39,656 out of 154,001, which is 26%. Japanese was 61,111 out of 154,001, which is an astonishing 40%, far outnumbering any other ethnic group. Straight-line interpolation is not entirely appropriate due to differences in which month the census was done, and the accelerating rate of immigration. But the approximate figures for 1893, overthrow of the monarchy, and 1898, annexation, would be 1893, overthrow, ethnic Hawaiians full or part, 40,063 out of 99,505, which is 40%. 1898, annexation, ethnic Hawaiians for law part, 39,580 out of 131,511, which is 30%. Discussion about significance of population data. The Bayonet Constitution of 1887, forced on King Kalakaua, had restricted voting rights to whites and Hawaiians. It was clearly in the interest of both whites and Hawaiians to prohibit Asians from voting, since Asians were rapidly becoming a majority of the population. Most Asians in Hawaii were plantation laborers under multi-year contracts, likely to return home after a few years and thus not having a long-term stake in Hawaii. On the other hand, babies born to Asian plantation workers would automatically be subjects of the kingdom who would grow up to have voting rights if they stayed in Hawaii. So to prevent him from becoming a huge voting bloc, it was necessary to strip Asians of voting rights. Some European and American businessmen had huge investments in Hawaii and therefore felt entitled to vote and influence the course of events even though they did not want to give up citizenship in their countries of origin. Upper-class Hawaiians and white businessmen were also glad to protect their oligarchy against lower-class riffraff, who might use voting power to demand government handouts at the expense of raising taxes on property owners. Therefore, the Constitution of 1864, under Lord Kamehameha I, had already contained property income requirements which had the effect of excluding many native fishermen and taro farmers as well as white trash, beach bums, and that effort to exclude riffraff was expanded in the Constitution of 1887, which raised the amount of income property required to be eligible to vote or to hold elective office. The Morgan Report contains testimony from several sources that about 90% of all the wealth and taxes in Hawaii came from whites, with about 75% coming from Americans or from Hawaiian nationals, native-born or naturalized, of American ancestry. For the 90%-75% figure, see for example the testimony of Peter Cushman Jones, pp. At the time of the overthrow of the monarchy in 1893, 60% of the population had not one drop of Hawaiian native blood. By 1900, when annexation was fully implemented under the Organic Act and the first U.S. Census was taken in Hawaii, 74% of the population had no native blood. Most residents of Hawaii were not kingdom subjects, citizens of Hawaii, because they were indentured plantation field workers or overseers from many places including Japan, China, Portugal, and many other nations. Some residents were foreign businessmen, sailors, etc., including former plantation workers who moved into town after their contracts expired, and investors or managers from the US and Europe. There were many Hawaiian subjects with full voting rights who had no native blood. And there were many foreigners who, although not naturalized as Hawaiian subjects, nevertheless had voting rights as denizens. A substantial number of legislators, both representatives and nobles, and nearly all the cabinet members, judges, and government department heads, had no native blood. Most ethnic Hawaiians probably supported the monarchy, but some favored the overthrow. For example, the Speaker of the House in the Republic legislature was native Hawaiian. Many non-natives favored the overthrow, but some supported the monarchy. For example, following the attempted counter-revolution by Robert Wilcox in January 1895, 22 whites of American ancestry and 3 Canadians were exiled to the US and Canada for their role in supporting Wilcox, and other whites were imprisoned. There were close relationships between some Hawaiian Ail'i in the British monarchy. For example, Queen Emma was the grandson of John Young, and Liliuokalani had attended the Jubilee of Queen Victoria, and Archibald Cleghorn had married Liliuokalani's sister and was the father of Princess Kaiulani. St. Andrew's Episcopal Church was founded by Queen Emma explicitly to establish closer relations between England and Hawaii. A book published in 2011 focuses on the massive immigration of Japanese as the main factor that prompted the US to finally agree to annexation in order to protect America's strategic defense needs in the North Pacific. The highly respected historian who wrote the book analyzed the Hawaiian Revolution and annexation, and Grover Cleveland's attempt to overthrow President de Gaulle and restore the Hawaiian monarchy. He gave special attention to Japanese immigration, Japanese diplomatic and military involvement in opposing annexation, and the normalcy of using joint resolution as the method of annexation. See book review of William M. Morgan, Ph.D., Pacific Gibraltar, U.S.-Japanese rivalry over the annexation of Hawaii, 1885 to 1898, Annapolis. Naval Institute Press, 2011, including numerous lengthy quotes from each chapter in the book. www.disruptarian.com Japanese annexation. The native Hawaiian government was notably racist toward the Japanese and Chinese plantation workers. The property income requirement in the 1864 Constitution would have excluded nearly all Chinese and Japanese plantation workers, even if they had been native-born in Hawaii or had taken a loyalty oath to become naturalized subjects of the kingdom. Of course, lower-class ethnic Hawaiians and whites were also excluded from voting rights in that same way. However, Asians were singled out in later legislation. In 1874, the Constitution was amended to remove the property income requirement but also to deny voting rights to all Asians regardless whether they were native-born or naturalized subjects of the kingdom. Then in 1887 the new Bayonet Constitution reimposed property income requirements which were even more stringent, and explicitly restricted voting rights to people of Hawaiian, American, or European ancestry, barring all Asians, even native-born or naturalized. Thus, from 1864 to 1874 to 1887, the kingdom's denial of voting rights to Asians became increasingly racist in proportion to the increase of Asian population. The native Hawaiians and whites were clearly concerned that Asians had an ever larger majority of the population, although most did not seek naturalization. But as native-born Asian babies grew to age 20, they would automatically become a voting majority, not needing naturalization, unless the laws prohibited them from voting. The political loyalties of the Asian population in 1893, whether royalist or revolutionist, are virtually unknown. None of them could vote, and most of them could not read or speak either English or Hawaiian. Many have been illiterate, impoverished, or social outcasts in their homelands. They were generally not regarded as having any political rights or influence, except for occasional, mostly unsuccessful, attempts to bargain collectively for wages and working conditions. However, testimony in the Morgan Report describes political activism by the Japanese legation, who made demands on both the Queen and the Provisional Government that Japanese should be able to vote on the same basis as whites and Hawaiians. Testimony indicates there was a conspiracy between the ex-Queen and the Japanese consul, whereby 800 Japanese plantation workers with previous military experience in the Imperial Army would support a counter-revolution by Liliuokalani in return for her agreement to give voting rights to Japanese. There was also testimony that a Japanese ironclad warship, the Nanawa, was expected to arrive in Honolulu within a few weeks after the revolution. There was also testimony regarding an incident shortly after the revolution when a large group of Japanese men with machetes were running toward a government building but were turned back by intervention of the Japanese consul. These frightening circumstances were some of the reasons cited by U.S. Minister Stevens in his testimony to explain why he allowed the raising of the U.S. flag alongside the Hawaiian flag on the government building, Ail'i Hail, at the request of the Revolutionary Provisional Government to indicate a partial U.S. protectorate to discourage foreign adventurism and to reassure the American and European businessmen and families of U.S. protection. See Morgan Report, testimony of John L. Stevens, pp. The overthrow of the monarchy in 1893 was the final act of a revolution started in 1887 with the Bayonet Constitution. The Reform Constitution of 1887 is also known as the Bayonet Constitution, because a mass protest of about 3,000 residents and kingdom subjects, including armed men of the Honolulu Rifles, forced King Kalakaua to sign the new constitution or else be overthrown. The protesters were angry at government corruption and the king's lavish lifestyle. Kalakaua had repeatedly thrown out cabinets which refused to sign his legislative proposals, and had openly bribed both elected representatives and appointed nobles, running the government as though he was a tin-horn dictator. The new constitution stripped the king of most of his powers, taking away his right to appoint the upper house of the legislature, nobles, and his right to dismiss cabinet offices. The new constitution also prohibited voting by Asians, some of whom had previously had voting rights as naturalized subjects of the kingdom. It further reduced the number and improved the quality of eligible voters by raising the property income requirement higher than it had been under the previous constitution of 1864. The right to vote was thereby limited to whites and Hawaiians who had substantial property or income, in hopes of ensuring responsible voting. The overthrow was not sudden or unexpected. For many years there had been growing opposition to the monarchy, for many reasons. Some of the reasons included the severe alcoholism, gambling, and dissolute lifestyle of the kings, official bribery and corruption, and the running up of huge government debts due to poor management. Kalakaua was the first reigning monarch who ever took a trip around the world. He also built Ail'i Palace and threw himself a lavish coronation ceremony, all at the expense of taxes generated by white businessmen based on the labor of Asian plantation workers. The so-called Bayonet Constitution of 1887 was forced on King Kalakaua by disgusted citizens and legislators to limit the powers of the king. For example, he was no longer able to either appoint or dismiss his cabinet officers without the approval of the legislature. And the members of the Legislative House of Nobles were now to be elected instead of being appointed by the monarch. The fact that this constitution is called Bayonet Constitution is not an exaggeration. The king had no choice but to sign it or be overthrown by force of arms. It was a military coup, which is one of the commonly recognized and accepted ways that revolutions take place. The final overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in 1893 was precipitated by her publicly announced intention to unilaterally proclaim a new constitution, violating the existing constitution she had sworn to uphold. Her new constitution would have restored strong powers to the monarch, including undoing the reforms of the Constitution of 1887. Her attempt to unilaterally proclaim a new constitution was a naked grab for power, and an act of treason, and it was the immediate precipitating cause of her overthrow. The Queen had appointed her cabinet ministers only a few days before the overthrow, and only after bribing the legislature to confirm them. Nevertheless, the cabinet ministers refused to support her attempt to proclaim her new constitution, despite threats of bodily harm. The Morgan Report has numerous testimonies describing how the Queen bribed the legislature to support the dismissal of her cabinet a few days before the legislature's term ended, and the appointment of a new cabinet favorable to the lottery, distillery, and opium bills, the passage of those bills, the closing of the legislature, and then the immediate attempt to proclaim a new constitution restoring royal prerogatives, and probably also limiting the right to vote to ethnic Hawaiians only. Although she ordered all copies of her proposed constitution to be destroyed when the revolution took place. Although only 40% of the population in 1893 had any native ancestry, the natives still had a large majority among people with voting rights. Today's Hawaiian activists insist that one reason the revolution was illegal is because only people with voting rights should be entitled to decide the form of government and its policies. However, another way of looking at the situation is that it is morally wrong for a minority to exercise powers secured by a racial restriction on who can vote, and also wrong for those who pay 90% of the taxes to be prevented from determining government tax and spending policies. All constitutions of the Kingdom of Hawaii restricted voting rights to adult men. Adding racial restrictions and property income requirements meant that a very small percentage of the population made the decisions a recipe for disaster and revolution in any society. Even setting aside the Queen's attempt to take power away from the legislature. The Wilcox Rebellion of 1889 was partly an attempt to undo the Revolution of 1887 by getting rid of the 1887 Constitution and restoring the 1864 Constitution, with much stronger royal prerogatives. King Kalakaua was actively plotting a coup against the Constitution, and was using Wilcox as a pawn in his political chess game. Meanwhile, Liliuokalani, the person who would become monarch if Kalakaua was unseated, was plotting a coup against Kalakaua and using Wilcox as her pawn. For details of both plots as reported in testimony in the Morgan Report, see the item in Morgan's Gems, entitled Dueling Palace Coup Plots. Were there petitions circulated among the people during 1892 pleading with the Queen to proclaim a new constitution? Certainly. Following Kalakaua's death in 1891, the new Queen made a traditional monarch's tour around the Hawaiian Islands, during which she heard the cries of her people, and received petitions for a new constitution. Liliuokalani was a very astute political operator. It seems likely that she had sent out advance parties to organize the petition drive in which her people, that is, the ethnic Hawaiian people would beg for a new constitution that would give the Queen much stronger powers. Surely far-flung farmers and fishermen living off the land in remote areas had more immediate concerns and would not spontaneously come up with a petition for constitutional reform. There's nothing wrong with drumming up support, it is normal politics. It also illustrates the same sort of ethnic and racial politics common throughout the world, and even in modern Hawaii. Ethnic Hawaiians were only about 40% of the population in 1893, and had been steadily losing power and influence for many years. The Constitution of 1887 had been a democratic reform, making the House of Nobles elected rather than appointed by the monarch. So the non-Kanaka majority was gaining increasing power in the legislature as well as in the appointive offices where they had long dominated. The monarch could no longer freely appoint and dismiss members of her own cabinet, without legislative approval. The Queen saw herself as the champion of her ethnic Hawaiian people rather than as the monarch of all the people. And the non-Kanaka majority were certainly aware of that and were determined not to allow her to reclaim dictatorial powers which would be exercised on a racial basis and against their interests. Imagine Queen Liliuokalani from the balcony of the palace trying to unilaterally proclaim a new constitution abrogating democratic rights and restoring great powers to the monarchy. Overturning a revolutionary constitution established 6 years previously which she had sworn to uphold as a condition of ascending the throne. Now imagine modern-day Queen Elizabeth II of England standing in Westminster on opening day of Parliament. And instead of reading the legislative programme written for her by the democratically elected majority in Parliament, she tosses it aside and unexpectedly reads a proclamation dissolving Parliament, declaring that henceforth she will appoint the members of Parliament and exercise her divinely given right to rule. If people took her seriously, there would certainly be a revolutionary reaction. The U.S. role in the Revolution of 1893. The Bayonet Constitution of 1887 was strictly an internal political and military coup. The United States government and troops had no role in it. During the period between the Bayonet Constitution and the overthrow, there had been at least 5 significant attempts to overthrow the new government, including a defeated Kanaka counter-revolution in 1889 led by Robert Wilcox, in which men had been killed and the roof of Ail'i Palace had been blown open by grenade. For a few years before 1893, there had been interest within the U.S. government in the possibility of annexing Hawaii. There were exploratory meetings and correspondence between the U.S. Secretary of State, the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, and U.S. military officers present in the islands, together with some of the local political conspirators hoping to overthrow the monarchy and produce an annexation. The USS Boston, which had been in Honolulu Harbor, took a cruise to Hilo and Lahaina a few days before the revolution, for long-delayed target practice and sightseeing. Everyone felt the political situation in Honolulu was stable. U.S. Minister Stevens went along on the cruise, accompanied by his 2 daughters. While the Boston was on its cruise, the Queen bribed the legislature, allowing her to dismiss her well-respected cabinet and appoint a new cabinet of dubious integrity. She secured passage of very controversial bills for a distillery, a government-sanctioned lottery, and an opium franchise. She then dismissed the legislature and immediately held a ceremony at Ail'i Palace in which the Huikalai Aina, a native political group, presented her with the new constitution she had written and intended to proclaim. She summoned her cabinet to the palace to sign the document, but they refused and 2 of them ran to a law office downtown. Fearful for their lives, several testimonies in the Morgan Report described the breathless arrival of the cabinet ministers at the downtown law office of W.O. Smith where they had fled for refuge. She stepped out on the palace balcony to speak to a crowd of natives who had assembled in expectation of a revolutionary new constitution. And she told him she could not proclaim the new constitution yet but would do so in a few days. Mass meetings were held in Honolulu. A royalist rally of about 500 was held on the palace grounds. A rally at the Armory on Beretania Street was organized by the Revolutionist Committee of Safety and attended by about 1,500 local men. Some at the Armory rally merely demanded major government reforms, most demanded that the monarchy be overthrown and replaced by a republic. And the leaders of the rally intended to use the political power gained from the revolution to seek annexation of Hawaii to the United States. Plans were made to reassemble the armed militias who had forced the Bayonet Constitution on Kalakaua in 1887 and had put down the Wilcox Rebellion in 1889. The incident that forced the revolutionists to urgent action occurred when a wagon load of rifles and ammunition was headed from a downtown hardware store to the government building to put armaments in place for the revolution, when a native royalist policeman tried to stop the wagon and was shot. The noise of the gunshot brought out crowds of people. The revolutionist militias quickly made their way to the government building. The proclamation overthrowing the monarchy was read hastily even as the militias were assembling. After taking over the government building, the revolutionists found a large stash of guns and ammunition that had been placed there by the royalists. The policeman who had been shot was only slightly wounded, and was visited in hospital the following day by leaders of the provisional government who wished him well. The deposed queen was escorted to her private home, where she was allowed to keep a substantial number of native royal guards, paid for by the provisional government, to protect her personal safety. Meanwhile, the USS Boston had been headed back toward Honolulu, with U.S. Minister Stevens aboard. The Boston arrived in Honolulu harbor the day before the revolution. As soon as contact was made with the shore, the ship's officers and Minister Stevens heard news about the political upheaval underway. Stevens and several ship's officers, who had homes in Honolulu, received pleas that troops should be landed to protect American life and property. It was clear there would be a revolution by armed militias to overthrow the monarchy. There was fear of violence against Americans and arson against American homes and businesses, and some actual threats had been reported. Accordingly, Minister Stevens asked Captain Wiltsey to send troops ashore, and Captain Wiltsey did so. Some of the troops were Marines, some were bluejackets, members of the ship's crew not normally intended for combat but who put on bluejackets and were given rifles. There were a total of about 160 men sent ashore. At the time the revolution actually occurred, the detachment of U.S. troops in the area of the palace and government building were indoors in a building half a block away and down a side road from the Main Street. The Morgan Report contains hundreds of pages of testimony from dozens of witnesses about exactly what happened. Some witnesses were local Honolulu residents, including some native-born or naturalized subjects of the kingdom. Some of those local residents were members of the Committee of Safety or the Provisional Government. Some witnesses were officers or men from the USS Boston. U.S. Minister Stevens, and U.S. Minister Blount, who had dueling diplomatic appointments in Honolulu simultaneously, gave lengthy testimony under vigorous cross-examination. The testimony included great detail about who did what, at what time on which day. Readers should go to the Morgan Report website and read the outline of topics containing highlights of each person's testimony to choose which testimonies to read. Each testimony title in the outline of topics is accompanied by a paragraph or two describing it. Long testimonies offer a summary of several pages, and every testimony can be read in its entirety by clicking on the page numbers at the left of the title of that item. The testimony was taken under oath, in public, and subjected to cross-examination. In the end, the 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans on the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs concluded unanimously that there was no conspiracy before the revolution between Minister Stevens or U.S. forces and the Committee of Safety or local revolutionaries, and there was no assistance given by the U.S. troops as the revolution unfolded. However, a minority of the senators felt that the presence of U.S. forces emboldened the revolutionaries or weakened the resolve of the royalists, and that the revolution might not have occurred if no U.S. forces had been present. It was clear from the testimony that different detachments of the U.S. forces were sent to various places to protect American life and property. In the area near the government building, the U.S. forces stayed inside the building where they were encamped except for 2 sentries. They did not at any time form a line by the government building, and they never took over any buildings or pointed their weapons at anyone. Taking over buildings and patrolling the streets was done by the armed militias of local revolutionaries. It is false to say that all or most of the members of the Committee of Safety were Americans. Ralph S. Kendall, The Hawaiian Kingdom, Volume 3, page 597 says, the Committee of Safety as first appointed was composed of the chairman H.E. Cooper, F.W., McChesney, T.F., Lansing, and J.A. McCandless, who were Americans. W. O. Smith, L. A. Thurston, W. R. Castle and A. S. Wilcox, who were Hawaiian-born of American parents. W. C. Wilder, American, C. Bolt, German, and Henry Waterhouse, Tasmanian, who were naturalized Hawaiian citizens, Andrew Brown, Scotchman, and H. F. Glade, German, who were not. After a day or two, Glade and Wilcox resigned, Glade because he had to return to Kauai, ed. Sir, a German, and John Emerluth, an American, replaced them on the committee, so, according to Kai Kendall, 7 of the original 13 were subjects of the kingdom, being either Hawaii-born or naturalized. The Morgan Report on pp. 1101 to 1102 has somewhat different figures, perhaps because the membership of the Committee of Safety changed from time to time. Responding to cross-examination by Senator Gray, Dr. Francis R. Day identified the nationalities of the 13 members of the Committee of Safety as follows. All 13 were long-time residents of Hawaii, who were registered as Hawaii voters: 5 Americans, 3 Hawaiians, 3 Germans, 1 English, 1 Scottish. All favored annexation to the United States. It should also be noted that many influential white subjects of the kingdom supported Liliuokalani. In any case, the U.S. government is not responsible for the actions of its citizens, or its former citizens, in foreign lands. Morgan Report testimony from several witnesses confirms that Minister Stevens was scrupulously neutral before and during the revolution. Some testimony indicates the Royalists were happy to see U.S. troops landed, because those Royalists thought the troops would serve to bolster the existing government. Some testimony indicates some revolutionaries were unhappy the U.S. troops had landed before the revolution, because they felt they could have succeeded in the revolution earlier, but the presence of U.S. troops would cause a pause or delay in the revolution, allowing the Queen to consolidate power. U.S. Minister Stevens, when asked for the first time to recognize the provisional government, inquired whether certain buildings were under their control. And when the answer was no, he refused to give recognition until that had been accomplished. Some testimony indicates he may have given diplomatic recognition prematurely, before full control was established. But when revolutions take place, nations favorable to them often give speedy, even premature recognition, while nations opposed often delay giving recognition. For example, U.S. refused for decades to recognize the communist revolution in China, and still does not recognize the Castro regime in Cuba 50 years after the revolution. The Provisional Government, and subsequent Republic of Hawaii, were internationally recognized by the same nations that had previously recognized the kingdom. On January 19 and 20, only 2 or 3 days after the revolution, the Daily Pacific Commercial Advertiser newspaper printed the official letters of recognition of the provisional government given by the local consuls of the following nations: Austro-Hungary, Belgium, Chile, China, Denmark, England, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Sweden, United States. Several of these nations had treaties with the Kingdom of Hawaii, and by recognizing the new provisional government they were thereby abrogating any treaty provisions that were specific to the monarchy and confirming that all other treaty provisions would be binding upon the new government. The speed with which these foreign nations gave recognition to the provisional government clearly shows that they had no doubts about the legitimacy of the revolution, and they felt no desire to prop up the ex-queen or seek her reinstatement. The British government delayed a day before giving written notice of recognition. Although the Morgan Report testimony of Mr. Hose indicates that the British consul informally gave recognition even before U.S. Minister Stevens did, it happened when Mr. Woodhouse whispered into the ear of President Dole, and a few hours later told Mr. Hose he had whispered his recognition of the Dole government. The written letters of recognition were published in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser. Mr. Hose newspaper clippings were presented to the Senate committee and are reprinted in the Morgan Report on pp. Some of today's sovereignty activists point out that most of those letters indicate only provisional recognition by local consuls, pending further instructions from their governments, and that most of those letters grant only de facto recognition. In response, it must be remembered that there was no internet, and no telephone or telegraph communication between Hawaii and other nations in 1893. Thus, it would require several weeks, or even several months, before the local consuls would be able to send communications to their home governments and receive formal letters of full recognition. In addition, some nations might want to wait to be sure a provisional, revolutionary government is stable and fully in control. But after the provisional government created a constitution for a new Republic of Hawaii, and held elections, that stability became clearer. The Constitution of the Republic of Hawaii, dated July 4, 1894, is available at www.disruptarian.com. Hawaii Republic. Interestingly, there were at least 5 ethnic Hawaiian names in the list of delegates to the Constitutional Convention who unanimously certified the Republic's new constitution. The Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Republic at the time of annexation in 1898 was ethnic Hawaiian.